The main reason I began creating these CSGO video tutorials was to try to help and encourage new artists with an interest in 3D or design to give Counter-Strike skin creation a try. So with this in mind, I've spent a good bit of time trying to figure out how to do a very similar process to my flexible based templates video in a free software called Blender. Due to the fact that I normally don't use Blender, I really will not be able to provide much support, but hopefully this process shown in the following video will be the springboard people need to learn more about Blender, 3D art and CSGO skin creation in general. I really hope you enjoy and find this video useful. So to start off with, the first thing you're obviously going to need to do is download and install Blender. If you don't know where to find the program, if you go to www.blender.org, you'll get this website and you can download it using this button here. The other place that you can get Blender from is through Steam itself, so if you search for Blender in the store, you should be able to download it from there also. As I mentioned at the start, Blender is a free piece of software that I imagine a lot of people give up their free time to help keep it fresh and up to date. So if you enjoy the software and want to donate, you can do so by clicking on the website up here. By donating, hopefully it will help keep the software free for longer and give more people the opportunity to use it. Once you've downloaded, installed and opened Blender, you should be greeted with a screen similar to this. As I said earlier in the video, I don't use Blender, so this video will just show you how to create design templates which you can use to project a design onto a 3D model. So the first thing to be able to do that is you need to get rid of this cube. The easiest way to do that is just press the delete button, and then once you get this message, you just need to click yes, you want to delete it. So once you've deleted the cube, the next thing you need to do is load in the weapon that you want to create the template for. The way to do that is go to File, Import, Wavefront, which is an OBJ, you can see here. You click that, it will open up a browser. Obviously, if you don't have the OBJ files, there's a link in the description to Valve's resources, which if you download will contain the OBJ files for the weapons. For the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to use the op, so I will open the op. Once the weapon is loaded, there's a few things to be aware of. Obviously, there's a lot of information on the screen. And to be honest, I don't know what most of it does, as I said, because I don't use this program. But there's a few things which is important for what we're going to do. The first thing is in the outliner, which is this area up here. Obviously you can see the camera, the lamp, which is a light, so if I toggle these on and off, the lamp's there and the camera's over here. But the thing we're interested in is the ones with these triangles. That denotes that this item is a mesh, i.e. like the weapon. You can see it's highlighted here. So the first thing I'm going to do is zoom out, and the way to do that is by holding Control and the middle mouse button. This allows you to zoom in and out. If you just press the middle mouse button, it will rotate, and if you press the Shift in the middle mouse button, it will pan. So with that you can get a better view of the weapon, like this. So now what we need to do is understand why there's two objects and not just one. Obviously we have one weapon, but we've got two objects. On closer inspection, what you'll realize is that the weapon is the main body of the weapon, but object 001 on this particular weapon is in fact the lenses. Now I can show that by using this button here, which toggles visibility. So you can see that the lenses are hidden. So one thing that you need to be aware of, and I've covered it in another video, which there's a link to on the screen now, the reason you often get projection errors is due to overlapping UVs. I'm not going to go into it here because I've covered it in another video, but with the op, one of the things which causes major problems with projections is in fact the lenses, because what they do is they overlap a lot of the different parts of the body of the weapon. So the easiest thing to do is to actually select the lenses, which you can do by going into the outliner and clicking the little triangle or the name of the object. Then, like we did with the cube, is press the delete button and then select delete. Now what that does is it deletes the lenses. Now that we've covered the basic of viewport control and talked briefly about projection issues, before we move on to creating our 3D template, I just wanted to quickly cover what a texture map is and roughly how it works. To help make this easier to understand and quick for me to demonstrate, I'm going to use another program. You will not need this program, it's purely being used to help with this explanation, nothing else. So as you can see, we're in this new program and we have our op here, which is exactly the same as the op in Blender. I painted a very basic piece of text on the side just to help with the explanation. The other thing that I've done is I have separated the body of the weapon from the rest to make it clearer. So as you can see here, all we have is the body. So the purpose of having this part of the model is to try and help explain what a texture map is. So to help do that, what I'm going to do is click this button here. Now what it's going to show is this object here is going to become flat, as you can see here. Now what this is a very small part of a texture map. A texture map is basically a way for the 3D model to be given a texture. Now hopefully you can see from this demonstration that all a texture does is flatten a 3D model. This allows you to create a flat texture which is then wrapped around a 3D model, as you can see here. That was of course a very basic explanation of what a texture map is, and I encourage anyone that is not familiar with texture maps or UV islands to Google it and try to further your understanding. Next we'll set up our 3D template. So to do this I will switch back to Blender. So now that we've covered the basics of how the viewport works, how texture maps work, and a little bit about projection issues that we might run into, what we're going to do now is create our 3D template. So the first thing we need to do is assign a texture map to this model. The way we do that is by going down to here where it says object mode and we change it to texture paint. When you do this you'll see the weapon becomes pink. Basically this means that there's no texture applied to this weapon. It will say up here data missing, missing texture. We scroll that out, missing texture slots. Now what we want to do is click add paint slot. We want to choose diffuse color. Now this is quite important. The first is a name, so let's just call it template. We can set our texture size. For the purpose of this demonstration I'm going to use a 2048 texture. Textures in video games need to be to the power of 2, so for example 256, 512, 1024, 2048, they're all textures which are to the power of 2. They also need to be square, so the width and the height need to be equal. So the next thing we need to do is set the color. Because this is for a template, we don't actually want any texture information. So what we're going to do is make the texture completely transparent. The way you do this is by clicking the alpha channel, which is here, and setting that to 0. As you can see, it gives you a checker pattern. Checker patterns in 3D programs and in 2D editing programs usually mean that the texture is transparent. It's just a way of visualizing that. So once we're happy with the color, we click here. We can have an alpha channel, that's not really an issue. We don't need to worry about these for now, and you don't need to use 32-bit float. So you click OK. Now as you can see, as soon as you did that, the pink disappears and is replaced by a base white. This is a little bit misleading because this object has actually got no texture, so it would be currently transparent. But in order for it to be visualized, Blender makes the object look white. Now that we have our base texture assigned, we need to create a camera view for our projection. There's several ways to do that, but probably the easiest way that I found is to go down to View, choose Right View, which basically moves your view to the right. Once you have that, reposition the gun so it's roughly in the center of the screen. Then go to View, Align View, and Align Active Camera to View. Now what that does is moves the camera that was in the scene, if I can show you, it moves the camera that was over here in the scene to align with the right view. To go back to camera view, go to cameras and then active camera. That basically moves your view back to the look through the camera. The next thing we need to do is remove perspective from this view. To do that, first select the camera, go to the camera tab, which is here, select orthographic. Now once you do that, you'll see the camera zooms in very far. To fix this problem, what you need to do is change the scale of the orthographic camera. So you keep zooming out until basically you have the whole gun inside this yellow box. Obviously, if the gun's not in the center, you can reposition that using your usual viewport controls. So roughly, we want to align it in the center. It doesn't need to be perfect, just rough. Once we have the gun in the center, we need to make this area larger. Now, in comparison to other 3D programs, I personally find this a little bit awkward. So I'm not sure if there's a better way to do this, but this is what I've found has been the easiest way to sort this problem. First, you got to here where this little plus sign is. You click that, and that gives you a whole bunch of options. The option you're looking for is lock camera to view. You basically want to turn that off. Once you've turned it off, if you press N on the keyboard, that will hide this box, like that. Once you have that, then you can use your normal viewport controls. So for me, it'll be Control and middle mouse button. And what I'm trying to do is make this box a nicer size, so it's easier for me to see. So once I'm reasonably happy with that, what I can do again is go back to the view and then lock camera to view again. Then press N to hide that. And now everything is set up correctly for allowing us to do our projection. So the next thing we need to do is save this template file. So we go to File, Save As. So we need to give our file a name. I'm going to call it Up3d template, and then click Save as Blender file. So that is basically our 3D template file with a camera position stored that we will use to project our design onto this weapon. One thing I wanted to mention before we moved on to create our 2D template is that sadly I've not found a way to be able to lock this camera in position. This means that if you rotate your view or zoom your view or move your view while you are in camera mode, which you can see up here, you're actually going to move your camera. So I'll show you what I mean. So what this has actually done is rotated the camera as opposed to just rotate the model. So you need to be very careful of that. If you move, rotate, scale the camera at all, then your 2D projection is no longer going to match and you're going to end up with errors. This is the reason why I always save the file after I've set up my camera. This means anytime I make a mistake like this, I can go back to my template file and know that the camera is in fact in the right position. So now that we have our 3D file all saved and set up, let's move on to creating our 2D template. To make sure that I don't run into any issues, I'm going to reload my template file. So now that I've reloaded my template file, what I need to do is create a 2D template. So the first thing you need to do is select your weapon. To do that, once you've selected your weapon, you go down to Object Mode down here and select Texture Paint. Once you're in Texture Paint, what you need to do is set up a few options. To do this, you go into the Options tab. For the purpose of our texture projection, what we want is for our texture to be projected all the way through the weapon. That means that when you paint something on this side, it will also appear on the other side. To do this, what we need to do is turn off Occlude, Cull. The other thing we want to do is turn off this normal feature. Basically what the normal feature does is when you project from the side, any angle which is more than 80 degrees will not have any texture projected onto it. Now all these features are actually very useful, but for the purpose of our projection, it's best to have these features turned off. This means that when we project our image, it will go all the way through the weapon, it will project onto the underside of objects, the top of objects, and onto both sides of the object, which for most designs is desirable, but of course there might be certain situations where you want to turn these features back on. Once we've turned these features off, we want to go to Tools. Now we want to use External. Now what this allows us to do is create an image which we can use in an external program to do our design. So what we need to do now is make the image size larger. As you can see, it's currently a very small image. These two values represent the width and the height of the image that this program will export to our 2D editing package. So for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to use a size of 2880 by 1620, which is basically 1920 times by 1.5 and 1080 times by 1.5, which will give us a image which is the same aspect ratio as this red box here. So once we've set our image size, which we've done here, we need to change our rendering mode. To do this, we go down to the little circle here and select Material. What this does is give us an image which just contains basic lighting information. Currently the lighting is not very useful for this weapon, so what we're going to do is go up to the lamp, which is this light here, and we're going to move the light to be nearer the top of our object. Like this. The next thing we want to do is select the properties for the lamp, which is this icon here. So if you're not on that, you need to go along and click this. Then I'm going to change this to a lin quad weighted, which basically creates a more linear fall off on our light, which gives us a reasonably nice piece of shading. Of course, depending on the weapon and depending on the position of your light, you might need to move this to make your weapon look better. But for now, that looks fine. Once we've selected this, we want to go back to the object and then make sure we're in texture paint mode. Then what we need to do is click Quick Edit. If you click this button and you find it doesn't open your editing software, what you need to do is go to File, User Preferences, File, which is up here. It'll probably open an interface. You go to File. So what you need to do is set this path to your image editor. In my case, I'm going to use Photoshop, which I've set up already. Once you've done that, you can go and click Quick Edit, and it will load up Photoshop and open the image which you had in Blender. Once the file opens in Photoshop, you'll be greeted with an image that looks very similar to what you had in Blender. The check pattern in the background basically denotes that this area is transparent. To make this file into a good usable template file, we're going to need to make some changes. So firstly, I'm going to drag in the layers palette. If you don't have your layers palette, you need to go to Window and enable layers, which is up here. To make this file easier to use, we need to make a few changes to the layout of these layers. The first thing that I would suggest doing is creating a folder, which is called a group. Create a group and we'll call this design. Then what we'll do is move our lighting layer into this group. You do this by selecting the layer and dragging and dropping it into the design folder. You can tell some things in a folder because it's slightly offset. Next thing we want to do is create a background layer. To do this, you go down to here, which creates a new layer. Then we need to drag this to the bottom. This will take it outside of this folder, which is what we actually want. You can make the color of your background any color you wish. This is purely to help you visualize your design. It's not actually going to be part of your design. So we'll just name it background. And I'm going to fill it with a grey color, which you can see here. The next thing that I would normally like to do is set this to be named lighting. This just lets me know that this layer is purely used for lighting. This layer is the background and this layer is the lighting. So now that we've renamed our lighting layer, the next thing we need to do is make this layer act more like actual lighting. To do this, what we need to do is change the blend mode to be hard light, and then the opacity to around 50%. Both the blend mode and the opacity can be tweaked to your personal preference, but I've found these work reasonably well. The next thing we want to do is limit the design to only be drawn on the gun itself. To do this, we hold Ctrl and click the icon beside the lighting layer. This will create a selection around our weapon. Now that we have our selection, the next thing that we need to do is go down to here, which is a layer mask, and click that. This creates a mask for this folder, which basically means anything which you draw inside this folder will be limited to only drawing on the weapon itself. This of course has no real effect on the projection, but it's quite nice for being able to understand how your final design will look. So I'll get rid of this layer. So now that we have our design file set up reasonably well, so the next thing we want to do is actually create some layers which we can use to design on. To do this, we go down to a new layer, which is here, click that. Now of course we always want our lighting layer to be above any of our design layers. If we don't do this, when we paint, the design will go on top of the lighting, whereas what we want is the lighting to be on top of the design. Like this. To help us better understand this file when we reopen it, we will rename this layer to be Design Layer 01. This setup that we have here is pretty much everything you need in order to be able to create a design and project it onto the weapon. So with that in mind, what we should do is save our file. To do this, we go to File, Save As, and make sure it's a Photoshop file, and we'll name it Op2D template. and then click Save. And you just want to say OK to that. So to quickly recap what we've done here, we've created a 3D template file and we've created a 2D template file. What I'm going to show next is how you use the 3D and 2D template files to create and project a design onto a 3D weapon. To better show how to use these two template files that we've created, I'm going to close both the Blender 3D file and the Photoshop 2D file. Now that all we have is Photoshop open with no files in Blender or Photoshop, what I'm going to do is show how you use these two files to create a new design. So the first thing you need to do is File, Open, and open your 2D template file. Once your 2D template file is open, you want to select your design layer. Once you have your design layer selected, you want to draw your design. For the purpose of this demo, I'm just going to do something really quick. If you want to add another layer with a different color, you can do that by going to New Layer. Obviously, name it. Design Layer 2, choose your color. And then draw the color on your design. Personally, I think that the blue is too big, so what I'm going to do is move the yellow above the blue layer, which just basically narrows it down a little. Of course, this is a very poor design, but it's good enough to show you the principles. So currently, obviously, we're creating a design in our template file. So if we were to save this file now, what we'd end up doing is saving these design elements into our template file, which is of course not what we want to do. So when you're happy with your design, rather than save over your template file, a good practice is to save this as a new file. So we'll go to File, Save As, and I'm just going to call this Op Demo. Once we've saved our file, the next thing we need to do is load our 3D template into Blender. To do this, we switch over to Blender, go to File, Open Recent, and then open our Op3d template. Once it's open, it should open in the camera orthographic view. If it doesn't, you need to select the camera view from the views selection. The next thing you want to do is check that you have weapon selected from your outliner, like that, and then you want to make sure you're in texture paint. Once you've done that, you need to go down to external. Now hopefully your image size will match the image size in Photoshop. But if it doesn't, all you need to do is go back to Photoshop, go to Image, Image Size, write down these values, and then put those values into here. Once you've done that, you should click Quick Edit, which will create a new template inside Photoshop. This template is linked to Blender, whereas our Op Demo template is not linked to Blender. So what we need to do is move the design from this template onto this template. It's very easy to do. All you do is grab your Op Demo, move it over to the side, select all the layers, and then while holding Shift, drag those layers onto the Op3d template that you got out of Blender. Once you've transferred the layers onto the Blender template file, which has got .png on the end, you can now close this file because you've saved it. Once this is closed, you'll be left with just the Op3d template file .png. This is the file that's linked to your Blender. Now that we have all the layers inside the correct template file, there's a few things you need to do to get this file ready for projection. So the first thing you need to do to get this file ready for projection is you need to remove all the additional lighting layers and background layers. To do this, you just select the various layers and drag them down to the bin icon inside Photoshop. Once you've done that, the next thing we want to do is remove our layer mask. The reason we do this is because if we have our layer mask on, there's a chance that the projection might not fully go around the top surfaces of our model. So the easiest way to do that is we select our mask and also drag and drop that into the bin. Once you do that, you'll see that the design now becomes much larger and covers areas which it didn't previously cover. This is actually what you want, so that when you project it onto the object, it gives you more room for error. The next thing we need to do is go up to our design folder, right click, and merge group. This basically creates it all in one layer, which means that we can then save our PNG file. So we go to File and then click Save, and that will save. Once we've saved the PNG file, we can swap back over to Blender. Now that we're in Blender, all we need to do to bring that design onto the weapon is to click Apply. Once the design is applied to the model, we're ready to export our texture. But before we do that, let's have a look at the design. Obviously, we don't want to move our template camera, so what we'll do is select a different camera. And then from there, we can rotate our model. And you can see that it's projected correctly right through the model, onto both sides, onto the top and everything else. If you're having trouble seeing the shaded side of your design, the dark side, one thing that you can do is select the weapon, go to the Material tab and select Shaderless. This basically allows you to see the design with no lighting applied whatsoever. To turn that off, you just check Shaderless again. Now that we have our texture projected onto our model, generally there'll be some tidy up required where there's errors created due to the projection. Blender has a host of painting tools which I won't go through, mainly because this video is getting too long and also because I've not really used them, so to be honest, I wouldn't be the best person to talk through these features. There's plenty of tutorials on YouTube explaining how the texture paint features work within Blender. So if you want to find out more, I would recommend googling like texture paint Blender and watch a video that talks through the host of features that are available within all these different menus. Now that our design has been projected, what we want to do is be able to export this texture as a flat texture map like we talked about earlier. To do this, what we need to do is go down to the cube here, click to UV Image Editor, which will show us our texture on a flat 2D plane. Once we have this, what we can do is go to Image, Save Image As. What this allows us to do is save our texture map. So what we're going to do is call it up demo and then go Save Image. Once that image is saved, we can go back to Photoshop. We can close this because we don't need it anymore. Go File, Open, and then navigate to where we saved our texture, which in this case is here. What you can see here is we have our generated texture map that corresponds to the various UV islands on our 3D model. Of course, just like any other image inside Photoshop, this file can be manipulated in any way you wish, using any of the features available inside Photoshop. To quickly finish this texture off, all I'm going to do is add a background color. So I'll create a new layer, and then get my fill tool, and I'm going to fill it with the grey. Now, if I was to save this texture out as a VTF, which is Valve's texture file format, then I'd be able to load this file into the workbench and apply it to a weapon. I really hope you found this tutorial useful. I really hope that it gives more people the chance to try out Counter-Strike skinning and weapon finishes. Good luck, and thanks very much for watching.